I'm really delighted to welcome back Professor Miriam Stark from the University of Hawaii, who is an alumna of the Anthropology department here at Michigan. And after that went on to do her MA and PhD at the University of Arizona. She is a full professor and the director of the UHM Center for Southeast Asian Studies. She's worked in Cambodia since 1996, and in the last decade, she's published on urbanization, ceramic production and distribution, and power relations in pre-modern Cambodia. Her archaeological research integrates work with capacity building in collaboration with Cambodia's Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts and its various units involving nearly 100 students, interns, and archaeological professionals since launching her first field-based research in the country. She's a Fulbright Senior Specialist right now, and Honorary Research Associate at the University of Sydney, an editorial board member on 13 journals. I don't know how you manage that, and was recently appointed a member of the Cultural Property Advisory Committee of the Department of State of the US government by President Biden. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Stark. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Dr. McCarthy. It's my pleasure to be here at my alma mater. Am I visible on Zoom here? And I was glad to be asked to give this talk today, which does have archaeology. I must apologize in advance. I am an archaeologist. It's unavoidable if I talk, but it's actually a general talk aimed at helping people understand part of Southeast Asia as a region, and specifically the Mekong Basin. Sorry, can we get rid of this? Can I just click on this? Okay. So this talk is really the result of many years of working in Cambodia and conversations with colleagues who work in Cambodia, some Cambodian, some not, and also just having to understand a region more deeply. I hope that what you get out of this presentation is a sense of long-term history. It's true that we live day by day. It's not just CNN anymore. And it's hard to imagine even that some of the kinds of conflicts we hear about today with Mekong dams and so on actually have roots in land use that go back thousands of years. So the argument I want to make is that the best way to understand a hydrographic region, a part of the world, cultural system, is to look at it in the long term. And that's what I hope to do today. So I call this talk Living with the Mekong: Archaeological Perspectives and Alternative Futures. And I'm going to start, forgive me please for people who know the region, I'm going to start with some introduction about the region, just so that we all know where we're talking about. And then I'll go on in this order. So to frame the study, I'll talk about the anatomy of the Mekong, something about the Mekong as a biophysical region and what's happened in the 20th century. Then, because I work in Cambodia, I'm going to take two views of the Mekong from a Cambodia point of view. That is the Mekong Delta, where I began my work in 1996, and then the Tonle Sap. And I've worked in the Tonle Sap region since 2010, both in Siem Reap and the Angkor region, and then now in Battambang. And then I'll talk about turning points, which of course, as an archaeologist, you have to take several thousand years back. So to me, the first turning point is a couple thousand, 3,000 years ago. And then I'll conclude by talking about any kinds of lessons from the past in managing the Mekong. And just so you know, these great rivers in Southeast Asia, like the great rivers in South Asia, they start out up in the Himalayas, in the Tibetan plateau. So we start up there, and I can't be absolutely sure that that is the place where the Mekong starts, but that's what people tell me. And so I kept looking and researching it. So it's not just this area of mountains, but right there, that water is the beginning of the Mekong that comes down, and we're going to take it all the way down through China and all these Southeast Asian countries and out into the South China Sea. From the headwaters to the mouth, you can see it's quite a distance and covers and affects many different countries, starting with China. So, and it has a different name everywhere it flows. So it starts in China with certain names, which I won't pronounce, but you can see them there. And this is one area that we have no control over, and China does, but that affects everything downstream. When it moves down into Southeast Asia, we have a consortium I'll talk about later that works on the Mekong from a Southeast Asian point of view. And so you see it go through Laos, you see it go through Thailand, where it becomes, by then it's the mother river, and it goes into Cambodia there you see, and then it comes out here in Vietnam. So the Mekong is a river that touches millions of lives, and it touches millions of lives as a single large watershed that you can see defined here. And I can only talk about some areas. So when hydrographers talk about the Mekong, they talk about the upper, middle, or lower Mekong. And I'm largely talking about what is called the lower Mekong region. It's been a source of great fascination to everyone, including European colonialists who tried to go all the way up the Mekong and found themselves really in a pickle by the time they got to the middle Mekong. But it is the case that down in the lower Mekong, at least in the pre-modern period, there was a kind of cultural and sometimes political coherence. So I'm going to start in the Mekong Delta, and I'm going to move up a little. The reason is in part because I worked in the Mekong Delta, and in part because it's like the canary in the mine for understanding what happens to the Mekong River. So the Mekong Delta is very big. The Vietnamese, as I understand it, view the Mekong Delta as largely being in Vietnam, but in reality, it goes up to Phnom Penh, and it's in Cambodia as well. It's got 9 miles now down in Vietnam, and it's this core area here has been known for several hundred years as a rice granary. It has been one of the most productive places in Vietnam, of course, northern Vietnam as well. And where I worked, of course, this is a map from our project. So I worked at an archaeological site that's called Angkor Wat, which is supposed to be the cradle of Cambodian civilization in Funan. But if you look at the Mekong Delta, you can see why it matters. This is just one of those satellite maps, and I put a triangle over it. But you can see this very dense area that's green, and that would be your rice granary. No matter where I've gone in the Mekong Delta, it pretty much looks like this. Some of these pictures are from Takeo province, just because I happen to be there a lot for about 12 years. But at least in Cambodia, until quite recently, a lot of the agriculture was not mechanized. It is moving towards mechanized. But everywhere people fish and they farm. And sometimes different people fish than farm. But unlike the Tonle Sap area, many times the same people who farm also fish. So it's very common to see both of those activities wherever you go. And these pictures are actually from the area in Takeo province, areas where we've worked. So if you go through a typical small, well, biggish village, I guess, in the Mekong Delta of Cambodia, you'll see places where people have small stores. You will see that farmers are involved in their farming. You'll see that water is never very far from life, and that the entire area is an agrarian economy. In Vietnam, there's industrialization going on, and that's happening more slowly in Cambodia. So it's really the lower Mekong Basin. That's where I'm working. Here's a map that shows you the whole area, and this is really the lower Mekong Basin. So one thing that you notice, if you skip the green there, is that this whole area is white, and it's white because it's all part of the same network. This is the Mekong, this is the Tonle Sap, but it's part of the same hydrographic system. The Tonle Sap River, which you can see up here, here's Phnom Penh, it goes all the way up into the Tonle Sap Lake, and all of it is dependent on the Mekong flow, right? So you can see people on the Tonle Sap River. You can go on it yourself if you'd like. And it does open into the Tonle Sap Lake, and some people who are here in the audience are very familiar with this area where you have traditionally floating houses, you have a very rich fisheries industry, and then of course it's not that far from Angkor, which was this pre-modern kingdom. And all of this is affected by the flow of the Mekong that starts all the way up on the Tibetan Plateau. You can see it and its effect because water comes down from the Mekong and conventionally goes into, let's see, so here's a good comparison of pictures from 2008. Conventionally, here's the Mekong River, and the water comes down with a lot of silt load. And by November every year, the silt load is so heavy that water backs up into the Tonle Sap and into the Tonle Sap Lake. So this is what it looks like in June, but by October, you can see it can quintuple in size. So from an agrarian ecology point of view, the fact that the Tonle Sap gets this big and then the water recedes creates a great opportunity for multiple rice cropping strategies. which is why it's been, we think, for several thousand years, an important place to live. And that's also getting affected by what's happening on the Mekong. So I'm going to start with the 20th and post-20th century Mekong turning points, and I'll go back in time from there. So we're going to go up the Mekong. And the points I'll make very quickly, because this is just a very brief talk, is that climate change is one driver. Energy is another, the need for energy, and specifically hydropower. But that there's another, which is politics and geopolitics. So I just grabbed this from, a development report on the Mekong. But all of it gets linked together. So you can see that climate change affects everything as more dams are put in at the regional level. And it does come down and trickle down to how people fish and how people farm and their livelihoods where they are today, right? And it could get worse because of climate change. So no matter what happens geopolitically, climate change is what concerns all of the modelers the most. This is just a 2018 publication talking about where it's hot and where it's not. So red is hot, just to be very clear. And also where we see changes in rainfall between 1985 and predicted from 2026 to 2041. And where it's dark, we see that there should be the biggest changes and the biggest increases. But one source of concern here is that if you look at the green areas, that's where you're going to have less rainfall. Another factor that will affect the Mekong. Droughts will probably increase in length by 2050. I just pointed out this is a largely farming area. This is going to cause problems for sure. Of course, these are all models and they distinguish between the Mekong mainstream and other areas, but you can see the change. Here's the baseline, and you can see the change here in the percent that some areas are going to be more affected than others. In Cambodia, large parts of Cambodia will be quite affected by droughts. Inland flooding can be a good thing if it's on a regular annual cycle, and it's a bad thing if it's not. We know because Pakistan is something like a third or 2/3 of it are underwater right now. So you can have too much water. This is not too much water, perhaps, but when you have too much water and you have flooding that becomes more severe, that also, of course, affects your ability to farm and also live in it. So you can see that the average flood duration is also probably changing through time. And finally, there are these pockets of vulnerability. So the climate modelers are very concerned with all this. And that's why I spend time on it. And I didn't put circles, they put circles showing the worst places to live if you're in the lower Mekong Basin. And you can see there's several of them. And that there's going to be all kinds of factors from changes in temperature and water availability to drought and flooding. Just one last point down here in this part of the Delta. The first time I read that there are times when people don't have enough fresh water in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, I was appalled. And this was a report from 1961 that said that in some areas down here now, well, not now, but in 1961, people literally had to buy fresh water during certain points in the year. So you can have a lot of water, you can have water that doesn't help you, that's salinated. And there's all kinds of issues coming up with the Mekong Delta. And the human footprint, so that's climate. The human footprint is also very big. And what you usually hear about the Mekong River right now is about dams. And I will talk about that as well. So you have climate, you have the human footprint, you have impacts that have already been felt down in Vietnam. And that's why I called it the canary in the mine. In this case, in Bến Tre province, there's already problems with rising sea levels. Those might not seem so big, but then they mean that there's more salinization that's coming further inland. There's less water coming down. And so people have had to switch crops already, like he's pointing at his sugarcane crops because he can't grow rice anymore. And in some cases, and he can't grow rice very well, you can see because it's not growing, right? So we're already seeing all this happening. These are ongoing issues with global warming, rising sea levels, delta drowning, and so on, lower sedimentation, right? In fact, it's so bad down in this mine, which is the Mekong Delta, that at least 1.7 million farmers have already left Vietnam's Mekong Delta. And that's since 2008, right? Because they can't farm. So they're moving to cities. All of this is just to show you that the Mekong Delta is both foundational to living in the lower Mekong and this part of Southeast Asia, and it's under threat from a bunch of different directions, right? You've got droughts, you've got water levels, coastal erosion. It's pretty grim, and this just shows you some examples. So how do we get here? How do we make it such a pickle, really? I want to talk about some turning points, and that's where my archaeology hat goes on, because people have lived in the lower Mekong Basin for a very long time. Arguably, people have lived in the lower Mekong Basin, if you include Battambang, which you must, at least 70,000 years. Archaeologists working in Laang Spian, an important archaeological site, have dates that go back 70 or 80,000 years. We don't have a really robust record for the next 78,000 years, but we definitely have that at the bottom of the levels they've excavated, and they're not done. So people have lived in this region for a very long time. We call all of that prehistory, and I'm only going to talk about the last several thousand years. Then we have a period that we call proto-history, which is when the Chinese first came to this region. It's when South Asians had contact with this region. And then the historical era is what most people know about Cambodia, if they know anything about its past, because that would be sort of the pre-Angkor to Angkor period with the big temples. And then you have this period afterwards I'll talk about, which is the 20th century. But I am an archaeologist. I have to show you archaeologists working. So these are students from the Royal University of Fine Arts. And I think they're working here. They're in Kampong Cham. So they're in the Maymot district of Kampong Cham. And they're excavating, and there's a lot of interested school kids watching them. We have all kinds of very important artifacts that we find in Cambodia that tell us a lot about interaction through time. Okay, but let's start with proto-history, because this is not an archaeology lecture. So let's just do a little bit of a booster to get into the period that would be more relevant for people in this audience. Sometimes people call it the Iron Age, sometimes people call it early historic or Funan. So starting around 2,500 years ago, what did the Mekong look like? How did it shape its human neighbors? This is the period of time I worked on when I first got to work in Cambodia, starting in 1996, until 2009, when I got lured up to Angkor. And it's the area that is the Mekong Delta, primarily in southern Cambodia and of course, southern Vietnam. We have a very robust record of human occupation, and in fact, the earliest urbanism in this region, arguably in mainland Southeast Asia, but there might be some parallels in Myanmar. They're very early as well, and in northern Vietnam. But we have evidence of urbanism. We have evidence of institutionalized religion. The Chinese have descriptions of coming to this area. They talk about libraries that people had. They talk about the gods they worshiped and so on. So it's a very important time period, and we can use science, radiometric dates, to tell you how old it is. So we have Chinese accounts, but we also have things like literally these wooden Buddhas that are in bad shape but still exist, and they have been radiocarbon dated to the 5th century. So it's not just art historians stroking their beard saying, gosh, that style looks 5th century. It's also literally, for what it's worth, the amount of carbon that we see in these materials. There are archaeological excavations. These are not mine. These are in Prohia. So that's a province next to Takayo, Pre Vang province, that show a range of different kinds of goods that probably reflect what made southern Cambodia and southern Vietnam, this Funan area, so rich. We have evidence of gold. People like gold. We have beads that suggest contact with South Asia, and very wealthy burials. Sorry, this was also the Royal University of Fine Arts, another team working with Andreas Reinecke. And then where I worked, which is Angkor Barai here, we have all kinds of evidence of not only the biggest site that's ever been documented. I was not the first to see it. Etienne Aymonier talked about it. And of course, the Khmers lived on it. But the site of Angkor Barai is here. It's 300 hectares. It's walled. The wall is about 4 meters tall. It's moated on the inside and outside. And there's temples all over it. There's also canals that connected all the way down to Akayo, which was a very important archaeological site in Vietnam. And there were previous colonial excavations there. So we know a lot about it. We did excavations, we did mapping, we did testing, we looked at canals, and we did survey to try to understand this area, which all grew up as a result of the founding of Angkor Barai. So we know that these people, that the people who moved down to the Delta were moving there and building cities, early cities, because they were tapping into the network, which was this riverine network, which would allow them access to the South China Sea, to the south, and all the way up into the Tonle Sap and up the Mekong. So we know that rivers, and specifically the Mekong system, was very important as much as 2,500 years ago. So, and people lived with it, they farmed with it. And the Chinese who visited Funan said they sow for 2 and they reap for 3, suggesting that they were able to get surpluses, which some geographers and anthropologists have suggested was from recession rice agriculture, which does not require irrigation canals. We have canals that transported people back and forth, and we have all kinds of non-intensive but extensive irrigation, farming systems, all of which people were able to utilize probably for the first time in this region. Okay, so what you probably know about is usually called the Pre-Angkorian and Angkorian era, and it all builds on that early foundation, which we see at Angkor Wat and Archaeological. And it's more familiar to people. You may not have seen these lovelies. These are 5th, 6th, 7th century statues. They're still from the Angkor Wat area, by the way, from the Mekong Delta. But also we have the first still preserved ritual centers. And so one of them is called Sambor Prekuk. Here it's in Kampong Thom. So from south of the Delta, moving up here. Here is just one example of the kinds of structures that were there. These were shrines. These were the kinds of things that would be in it. He was in a cave south of Angkor Wat. But people built these very big ritual centers, and Sambor Prekuk was the biggest. We have inscriptions, people talking about their gods, about donations, rarely talking about geography or politics, but the Chinese also fill us in. And again, when you look at this and the location, Kampong Thom is at the edge of the floodplain of the Tonle Sap, right? So we're always seeing that these big centers are developing along the edges of the Mekong and its tributaries. That's always important, and it's always an important agricultural strategy. So I have this picture to show you that even Archaeological and the sites down in Vietnam, those were all located right off of the Mekong on its tributaries. Then you have in Angkor Wat, and then you have this area here with Sambor Prekuk, and all the way actually up to Ston Trang and into southern Laos, up the Mekong. You have these ritual centers emerging, but the 6th through 8th century. And then later you have this area, which is the location of Angkor. Okay, so let's go to Angkor Wat. I gave a lecture once, and as a mistake, I guess, for the Archaeological Institute of America, I didn't show a picture of Angkor Wat first. And so now I'm just showing it to you so that you can see that this is Angkor Wat. It's still the largest religious monument in the world, although apparently India is trying to build a larger, I think it's India is trying to build a larger one right now. But this is the biggest one, and you should know that it existed. But it's not just that there was Angkor, which is here, is that Angkor was connected to temples and provinces and capitals, sub-capitals, I guess, provincial capitals, all over a much larger area. So here's Angkor, all the way down Phnom Chiso. We were down there at Angkor Wat, over here in Kampong Cham, over here in Kampong Thom, over here all the way into Laos, all the way up into Thailand, and throughout Cambodia. So this is the kind of network we know existed. We know it because of inscriptions that cross-reference different rulers or talk about rulers from here, who went there, and so on. So for example, where we work now at Wat Basait, we know there was King Suryavarman I came down to Wat Basait and he installed his important monuments. And he also went down to Phnom Chiso and he installed another monument. And he went up to Wat Phu, he went to Pre Bahia and he did another. So we know that it was a broader network. But most of the Angkorian world didn't look like temples. Most of the Angkorian world was rural, which is what most of the Cambodian world still is. And if you get yourself up in some sort of hydroplane, this is what it looks like from the sky. This is around Siem Reap. But what's interesting is these are contemporary farmsteads, and they're built directly on Angkorian sites, because that's where you want to live if you want to farm, right? And it looks like this if you make a big, messy archaeology map. And I've been part of the Greater Angkor Project with the University of Sydney since 2010. And one goal is to map out 1,000 square kilometers that look like this. And we have team members who have done that. It has taken 25 years, but they have done it, right? So that's what it looks like. And this is what it looks like if you're on the ground. It's still largely agrarian. Floating rice field. This is in Takeo province where I was, because like I said, that's where my pictures are from. But floating rice is important. Rain-fed rice is important. And now canal-based irrigation is becoming a bit more important, but it's quite expensive. Back to Angkor, it was a very significant city. exclude China. China always had the biggest cities in the world, in the pre-modern world. But if you exclude China, Angkor had the largest pre-modern city in the world. It was huge. It was not only big, this is an arbitrary mapping of it based on the United Nations efforts to try to develop a zoning and environmental management plan in 1992, right after the peace accords. But even in this area, this 1,000 square kilometer area, what you see is fairly a lot of occupation, a lot of water features, these big barai, which are reservoirs, and big temples, many, many big state temples, right? My research has focused on Angkorian state formation and on the development or emergence of empire. And work by my colleagues has looked at the reach, the political reach, and some of my ceramics work has too. And all of this has been made possible because of this agrarian foundation. And all of the agrarian foundation, and all of these temples, and all of these monumental bits of architecture were made possible by rice surplus. And the rice surplus was made possible by the Mekong. Like, it all comes back to the river. And you have to remember that. Without the great river, you would not have a great civilization. And that is true in Egypt, and that is true in Pakistan. That is true in all parts of the old world. They're all based on their rivers. So people always knew how to navigate and negotiate with their rivers, right? People have called Angkor a hydraulic city. It certainly was located on the banks of the Tonle Sap. This is one of those cool National Geographic Society reconstructions that we all love. And we don't know if it exactly looked like that. We don't know if these were all rice fields, but they might have been. And our mapping suggests that it's quite likely that people used as much of the area as they could, so that as the Tonle Sap got bigger and then it receded, they could farm there too. It was built on rice and water. And some of my colleagues at the University of Sydney are very interested in how the Khmers managed their water within their city, largely to protect the city from getting flooded. And they've dated all the segments so that they can figure out at what point which Khmer ruler rerouted which river. And the Khmers were very good at that, not just the Chinese. So they were rerouting various rivers to make sure they didn't go into the city. They were putting in these giant reservoirs. They did some limited irrigation. It wasn't small, but it was not the most significant portion of their foundation. And by the end here in the late 12th century, you have a pretty complicated or intricate system of water that takes the water down from Phnom Kulen up here all the way down into the Tonle Sap. So and this is what it looks like. It's a big mess if you want to study it. But this is what it looks like if you look at the city core by that time. Lots and lots of involvement in managing water, right? And then something happened. 1300, 1400, the Thais would say 1432. We would say, based on our rainfall records, based on our pollen records, based on inscriptions, that Angkor started to crumble by 1300. Not Angkor itself, but people started to move away. But not everyone moved away. So there is this narrative of the collapse of Angkor, the disappearance of the Angkorians. Actually, they didn't disappear. Actually, a lot of people stayed and farmed, but the capital moved. And that is important. And we do think that it has to do with a lack of willingness or ability to manage an increasingly climatically erratic environment. Remember that, because that's what we're heading into now, an increasingly erratic climatic environment. The Angkorian world changed. It didn't disappear. People moved to a series of capitals. This is a Dutch painting of Longvek, which was a very important capital afterwards, right there in Udong. So here's Angkor. They went to Longvek, they went to Pursat, they went to Sri Santor and Phnom Penh. All of these were capitals. But the whole time that you have the capital moving, people are still in Angkor. There are still tens of thousands of people in Angkor farming, just like they did before, right? And by the time the French decided that they needed to take over this area and call it Indochina, and these are some of the characters who I like to credit in the mid-19th century because they were mapping the Mekong. They had to understand the Mekong. They hoped to go up to China with it. They did Mekong expeditions, and they ran into waterfalls that kind of stopped their voyage. But anyway, the Mekong remained important. The Mekong Delta was always a little dicey for them. It was considered a bit dangerous. It was very swampy. It was a bit malarial. But slowly but surely, you have the movement of people into the Delta and the French canalizing this area. This is before they put in all the canals. And you have the movement of Vietnamese into the area displacing Khmers. Then you have the independence movement after World War II. And in each of these Mekong countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, you have the establishment of independence. But you have a century of human impact on the Mekong that's very important. And it's this last century that's really injured the Mekong more than anything else. You have the first Indochina War, which was right after independence, when the French didn't want to give independence to Vietnam. And then you have the second Indochina War, which we call the Vietnam War, when the Americans didn't want to give independence to Vietnam, and also exacted quite a toll on Laos and on Cambodia. And then you have the third Indochina War, which was where the United States was less involved, and it has these different pieces you know about: the Khmer Rouge regime, the Hmong insurgency, the Cambodian-Vietnamese War, and the Sino-Vietnamese War. And all of these exacted tolls on the Mekong region. Sometimes unintentional. Americans thought they could win hearts and minds by putting in a dam system along the Mekong in the 50s. There was a Mekong committee that literally brought specialists who had worked in the Tennessee Valley Authority to the Mekong region to propose dams, because everyone likes dams because of hydroelectrification. And all of these dams were proposed. USAID said, we'll help you with them. A few went in, and then the area collapsed into war. So most of them didn't then. But if you stare at this map long enough, you'll see that later on, these dams are getting built. In the 1990s, you see the development of mainstream dams and of lots of dams up, of course, in China. Remember, I showed you where the Mekong started. So here's an example of some dams that are operational. And you can see that most of the ones in China are. Laos has been an area of a great number of dams, and so has Vietnam. But Cambodia also has planned dams under construction. And these also are very tough on a river. What's also tough on a river are systematic sustained bombing campaigns, like the one the United States did for years, because of the amount of ordnance that it drops. So what it does is endanger the people who want to live in that area, because there's a lot of unexploded ordnance. So first you kill lots of people and destroy areas, and then there's ordnance in your fields, right? And this is a map that's from the US government, and everything that's red shows our United States bombing campaigns all over. Obviously, there's a lot up here in Vietnam, but look at how much was in Cambodia, right? That's not landmines. I'm just talking unexploded ordnance. And then we decided, the United States decided it would be very convenient to use herbicides to defoliate areas so that the Viet Cong couldn't hide, right? And so for 10 years, there were 20,000 sorties, over 10% of South Vietnam. South Vietnam, that's all the Mekong catchment. What 12.1 million gallons of Agent Orange, that's 19 to 20 million gallons of all herbicides were dropped in this area. And so that's contaminating groundwater, and that's affecting the soil as well. There's dioxin spraying. You can see what mangroves look like when you have them, and then you don't after you spray with dioxin. So there's all kinds of stuff going on. You have hydroclimate, you've got bombing that makes it hard to farm. You have herbicides coming into this area. And all of it is affecting this general catchment, which is schematically presented here, right? Okay, so managing the Mekong, where does that leave us? Gosh, the last 100 years have been pretty hard on this river system. Well, there are in-region organizational committees like the Mekong River Commission, which does not include China to the best of my knowledge, but which takes this initial structure of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and creates a structure for trying to make decisions at a collective level about the Mekong. The fact it doesn't have China could be considered good or bad. There's autonomy, but I showed you all the dams up there, so it's very problematic, and there's a lot of Chinese investment in dams. However, there are now international collaborative structures that are meant to try and mitigate impacts on the Mekong. Local decision-making has a very small role, but there are pockets of hope. And so I have an example here of how in Cambodia, in Siem Reap, there's program consultation about forest management. And you can go down into the Delta to Pre Veng, and there's villagers who want to protect white-winged ducks, which are very important and also, I believe, migratory on the Mekong. So you have some of that. But the problem is that the weight of geopolitics and money often overwhelms local involvement. So just for a minute, I'll talk about what's called the 3S dams, because there are these three rivers, Say San, Srei Pok, and Srei Kong, and they're tributaries of the Mekong River. You can see that. So here's Cambodia, this weird fluorescent area is what we're talking about. And it's very important that you have these rivers because they go into Vietnam. And so there's this plan to dam them because just like in the 1950s, it was suggested that this would be a very good area for dams by USAID. But the problem is people who live there don't want the dams because it's going to affect their livelihood. And I mean, here in Stung Treng, there were villagers who worked very actively to try to oppose the dams. There are, just have to point it out, there are archaeological sites. There are spiritual sites. There are homes of their local spirits. And here there's a local spirit medium and she's asking the spirits to intervene. So there's a lot of local protest against dams you just don't hear about. But where it goes, it depends on the country. So you have climate change, you have dams, and Cambodia's Mekong, and those are the issues today. There were not dams in the pre-modern past, so it was different. But you can see that all of it is linked together so that you have climate change, which I pointed out first, which affects your water supply and the Mekong water flow. And then you have these dams coming in and they affect how much flooding you have. And that in turn affects the size of your fish stocks. And finally, every single Cambodian who lives within that Mekong catchment gets affected in their protein intake. So it's a very significant and important and personal kind of impact that this takes. I was glad to see that in 2020, there was a bit of a reprieve from one of the dams. Well, they didn't scrap it entirely, but they scrapped it partially. So we don't know what will happen, but it's a factor that they say they won't build any more hydropower dams until 2030. Right. So what happens if we now step back, we're reeling from the impacts on the poor Mekong River, and think about how Cambodians have worked with their dams? What are elements of Cambodian culture and tradition that might help us understand how we should be treating this river? I wanted just very briefly to mention 2 points, one which you could call collective action and the other which you definitely must call cosmology. And positionality here, I'm just an archaeologist, I'm on the outside, but anthropologists have worked with Khmers to understand more about collective action and get their ideas from Khmers. And archaeologists, well, we do the best we can. We seem to know something about the past. I wanted to start by pointing out that all over the world, anthropologists talk about how smallholder systems are resilient. Large industrial systems are not. They're quite fragile, actually, but smallholder systems tend to be quite resilient. And in Cambodia, one reason why they have been resilient, and this is in the pre-Khmer Rouge past, is because households were autonomous, but they worked together when they needed to. And there's an institution called Pro Bat Dai, which is something like helping hands, where farmers in communities would work collectively to plant and also to harvest crops for their neighbors, because it helps everyone. You don't have to be a good person to do it. You just have to have self-interest and some sort of insight to know that it's a very good idea. So because of that, it's a very resilient kind of strategy. This is very common in smallholder systems. I also saw it in the upland Philippines where I did my dissertation work. So for transplanting and for harvesting, these are very labor intensive systems, but people help each other. That's if they have their own land. There's also a belief in the importance of water. Cambodians have always loved their water, as far as I can tell. These are just some fun pictures from the water festival that's usually held every November. You can actually see celebrations across the country, although Phnom Penh is where most people go. And the water festival is held when the water reverses. Remember, I said usually the silt comes down and the water backs up into the Tonle Sap. And so there's a big water festival, big races. But we see it also in 12th century Angkor that you have these big boats, which look actually very similar to the boats you see today. And if you want to take it back even further, I want to give you a dong son drum, which is from northern Vietnam, because it was common all over this part of Southeast Asia. And if you look, these are big bronze drums that are about 2,500 years old. There's people on boats too. So having a relationship to the water matters. Sorry, one thing you can't see, there's frogs all over the top of these. There are frogs. So water cosmology, very important. And treating water with care is very important in the Southeast Asian worldview. I want to take you to the Met right now for a moment, and I won't go into details of why you really should be thinking about Khmer antiquities at the Met, but let's just go inside. Let's see what they got. Oh, okay, we're there. We're in the gallery that's got Angkorian and Pre-Angkorian antiquities. And you can tell because you've got this four-faced image here. These are all from Cambodia. And most of these are from the 11th through 13th centuries, although there could be some that are earlier. I want to focus on one. I want to focus on this Bapuan period deity, and she's from the 11th century. She's only 17 inches tall, and she's paying homage. She's praying to spirits. And I look at her and I wonder, what is she? Who is she praying to? Is it to a king? Is it to her cosmos? And I think that she and many of these other religious figures were celebrating and acknowledging the cosmology that guided Angkor, and that focused on water. Everything was about water. That's why they were rechanneling rivers. That's why they had big reservoirs. That's why they went to the source, and the source is the Kulen Hills, right? And they went up to these hills and they built up there. They took the waterfalls where their water came from, and they carved Vishnu and their gods into the waterfalls. Not only did the water flow over Vishnu here, it flowed through a stream. And before it did, there's Vishnu. And then it would run over these lingam, which are also Brahmanic images of power. And then it would go over a stream. And this is the river of 1,000 lingam. All that water that went into Angkor, it came down this way. And it was all sacred water. It was sacralized by the Khmers as it was moving down from its source. They were very aware of that. And there it came into the Tonle Sap Lake and the Tonle Sap River, right? So for the Khmers, it's very clear that water was sacred. They made it sacred. They recognized it as sacred. They treated water with reverence. And that's what I think we should think about when we move forward with the Mekong River. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Do we have any questions from the floor? Orvin?
Hi, I'm Orvin. I'm first year PhD student in anthropology. Very amazing talk. I came here wanting to learn about the Mekong region, and I learned so much. I'm gonna go read more about it later. But there's something that you mentioned that really connected to me, or really resonated with me, and that's that Mekong Committee in the 50s. I don't know if you know too much about that, but I was really interested in hearing about American researchers walking into this area and using their scientific expertise to you said win the hearts and minds. And you talked about like the legacies of that sort of in the Mekong River communities today. What kind of involvements are still going on in terms of these foreign powers going into river planning committees and projects? And in addition to that, I wanted to ask for a little bit more clarification on if there's still any Chinese involvement in that Mekong River Commission, the current one that's connected to ASEAN.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind words. And I'm going to warn Dr. Chan Sophia that I might ask him for some help on the last piece there on Chinese involvement. But I could tell you a little bit about the 1950s. The US, I mean, you're probably familiar with this. The whole Cold War history in Southeast Asia is very important to understand if you are studying Southeast Asia as someone based in the US, whether you are a US national or not. Because for a long time, the United States was deeply involved. Remember, they were funding the French, even up to Dien Bien Phu. And then this is just in this region. And then, of course, they were funding Southern Vietnam. And then they didn't seem to mind the overthrow of the Cambodian regime, and then did outright support Lon Nol when he was there, right? So that was all in the 60s, from the 50s through the 70s. But there was also a push at international development. And international development, I don't want to give it a bad name because there's a lot of really important, useful kinds of progress that's been made through international development. But there was this sort of white man's burden notion of development back in the 50s. And so one of them was, well, gosh, these people have this very nice river. And we just did this with the Mississippi River, and it seemed to work so well. And then we've been damming all our rivers actually in the United States, and we just love doing it. And it shows American ingenuity. And so they literally brought planners who said, look, we could do this. Like, we can do this for you. You need electricity. And so, so this is what it would look like. So I don't mean to say they were nefarious at all. I mean, if you talk about the history of dams in the United States, you know that in the Pacific Northwest, now we're trying to take down the dams because it's affecting the ecology, but people didn't know it then. And we know that flooding that happened in New Orleans could be because of both the dams and because we've overbuilt our river system. So they can't operate with their natural floodplains. But in the 1950s, it seemed like a good thing to do. It was a shiny good thing to help people. So they did it with all the best intent, that is the people who came in and planned. And for the Americans, they felt for a long time that if they engaged in economic development, particularly in areas like Northeast Thailand, but in Laos, I guess in Southern Vietnam, and certainly in Cambodia, that would help bolster those countries against the need to become communist, right? So the US was actually putting millions of dollars into not just Southern Vietnam, but I think also into Cambodia for a very long time. And Laos, that's a different story. But that was just one piece of it, right? And so actually it went into the mid 60s before King Sihanouk said, we've had enough of the Americans. And it went back and forth because the Americans had a lot of money. So they had the template, they had the maps. Now, I don't know the origins of the Mekong River Commission. I can't speak to that. And I also want to point out that they have been very explicit about not having China as a partner. But would you like to talk a little bit about the Chinese involvement in dams? Is that okay for me to ask you, Sophia?
Clarify the question a bit.
So I'm sorry, what's your name again? Orvin was asking, what's the level of Chinese involvement in dams along the Mekong?
It's a very complex question. I think it's the Chinese, because China is not part of the MRC, Mekong River Commission. They build whatever dam they want to build along the mainstream of the Mekong. And Chinese have the technologies. So they want to, you know, technologies, a lot of like private interest, like a business corporate interest in investing the dam elsewhere. And Cambodia is just right next to it. And China is also, you know, in expanding its economy throughout Southeast Asia. And so I think a lot of the dam in, at least the one that's been built now is built by the Chinese companies. That's what I know, yeah. And yeah, so I think that's it.
Sorry, I wanted to add, so Dr. Chan Sopiak is at the Royal University of Phnom Penh, but he's a visiting scholar at Michigan State this year. I'd add just a couple points. One is we tend to think it's China that's building the dams, but Dr. Chan pointed out, it's often Chinese companies. It's not the government necessarily, but China makes that possible to happen as part of their Belt and Road Initiative. Laos is I understand, on the verge of bankruptcy because they've accepted so many loans from China as a country. So they're very dependent. I don't think Cambodia is in exactly that position, and Cambodian government says they're not. They say they balance their investments more wisely.
It's a complex business operation that some of the mega sort of infrastructures in Cambodia is invest partly by Chinese government or Chinese bank, development bank. Some are Chinese are also constructors company. So there's kind of like work together, and some of the investment are not invested by the Chinese companies, but built by the Chinese. So so within the Chinese kind of operation in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia, it's not just the Chinese government, it's also corporate within the sort of business that is expanding across the world, I think.
You're welcome.
Hi, my name is Ian. I'm a first year's master's student in the MERS program here. I just kind of had a follow-up question with this kind of discussion about China, and just in terms of their geographical position, kind of controlling the, I guess, source and the high ground of the river. Does this ability to kind of project downstream play into these negotiations? You mentioned how Laos has taken on, possibly more loans that they can even handle. Does this, does the kind of implied threat of controlling this incredibly vital water source and livelihood source that China has kind of influence these kind of trade negotiations and loans and go beyond just the actual physical water itself?
Nice to meet you, Ian. Okay, so I'm an archaeologist, not a political scientist, but I would say, what I can say about that is I study long-term history. And so one problem is that if we just use a 5-year period to talk about impact, it's not very accurate. That being said, there is a Mekong Monitor. This is in DC. There's a think tank there, and they're literally with their Google technology, they are monitoring all the dams, I think in China as well, and when they let water out and when they don't, which is a way to tell the Chinese, we're not believing what you tell us. We're going to literally watch what happens. And they have argued that you can already see impact downstream. Excuse me. But then there are counter arguments saying, oh no, this year Tonle Sap fisheries were great. We had great returns, just like you'd expect. So if you take a very short-term perspective, then you can make an argument in either direction, which can benefit those who support Chinese investment in this part of the Southeast Asia and the Mekong region. But if you're an archaeologist like me, then you say, really, we're not going to know how this rolls out for another 80 years. Because I work in chunks of hundreds of years, of centuries. And that's where you can see impact. Rivers move, rivers recede. There's a lot of things rivers do on their own. And then you have these climatic fluctuations that can be multi-decades. So does it come into discussion? Yes. And one side will say, you see, we've got lots of fish. We're fine, we're good. Laos dams don't make any difference at all. And the other side will say, we see that you're not doing what you said you would do. You're not letting the water out. And so I think it gets muddled by people who are using year-by-year data. It's great to have granular data. We need that. But then what we need is we need to be able to look at longer-term patterns. Yeah. If
I can take the opportunity to ask a question a little more archaeological. So what you showed us is that for at least 1,500 years, people have been working on water, with water, redirecting water, including through Angkor Wat. And so the canals, the reservoirs were, precursors in a certain way to all of this Tennessee Valley Authority business and the Chinese coming in and doing their thing. And what we're beginning to see is maybe some of the unintended consequences of this recent work. Can you tell us something about the unintended consequences that archaeologists have pieced together, maybe from these projects in Angkor Wat and the other cities?
Yeah, thanks. I think no one has really articulated it much because we've gotten stuck in very sort of basic arguments. There aren't enough of us working, but eventually there will be. And so the basic challenge for a lot of archaeologists is to try and overturn that predominant narrative that Angkor collapsed and the Angkorians disappeared, because they didn't. And so a lot of people have been using pollen cores and dates and work in different places on that. So we haven't gotten there yet. But I think, I wrote one article because I'm opinionated. I think where we're all moving is the direction I hope, which is what I'm writing about, which is that they overbuilt. They overbuilt their water management network. It's beautiful, but it was so, it became very brittle because it was extensive. It was intensive and it was extensive. And then you have climate change happening and people walked away. I don't think it's that the Khmers couldn't do it. It's that they wouldn't do it. It was too involved. And you'd have to have an incredibly charismatic ruler who could convince them to put in that amount of time to keep these very intricate water systems working. And what was more resilient was before they had all that, because they could go for centuries just with flood recession, water, rice agriculture, and rain-fed rice agriculture. So it got to a point where they'd overbuilt. There's certainly one king who's sort of famous for overbuilding, Jayavarman VII. This is different. That water system, every time there was a flood, then they'd have to go out and they'd have to fix it. And then they'd have to do a workaround. And that's what my colleagues have documented is a century and a half or 2 centuries of workarounds during these climate, these periods of drought and then flooding. And I think they walked away. They said, not worth it. Like there's reasons to go south and this is too much work.
The they being ordinary people, elites, or both?
I think ordinary people stopped working for the elites because the elites couldn't make the argument that was persuasive enough. That's what I think. I don't know because I didn't live there, but that's my feeling. And that's what happens. The people will walk away from leaders. If they don't get enough from their leaders, they walk away. There's no level of despotism that we can document archaeologically, no matter what Bifokal said, that would convince ordinary people to give up months of their lives every year just to work for the state if they're not getting something out of it. That's just me.
Any other questions? We're at time. So yeah, I want to invite you all to join me in thanking Miriam for a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you.